Elizabeth walked the streets, moving slowly, almost like a shadow among the bustling crowd. Her hair, wild and tangled, whipped around her face as the wind picked up. People passed by, their eyes darting towards her, their whispers lingering in the air. They didn't know her, not really. They saw only a girl, too young to look so worn, her clothes stained and torn. At just 19, Elizabeth had seen too much. The streets had become her home, the alleyways her shelter. Each night, she curled up in corners, hoping to make it to the morning without being disturbed. She scavenged for food, her thin fingers digging through trash bins. The sounds of laughter from nearby restaurants mocked her, a constant reminder of what she didn't have. Yet, in her heart, there was something the city could not take from her. Even as the judgment of strangers clung to her, Elizabeth carried a quiet belief, a belief that her life was meant for more. When the stars appeared above her at night, she would lie on the cold, hard ground and dream of another life. A life filled with warmth, with love, and with people who saw her for who she truly was. Thousands of miles away, Charles sat in his quiet home, lost in thought. His hands rested on his lap, worn and lined from years of work. At 70, life had taken him on a long journey. He had traveled the world, helping others, searching for something to fill the void left after his wife passed. Africa had always called to him, a place of vibrant culture, of people whose smiles shone like the sun, even in hardship. It was there that he felt closest to peace, though his heart still ached for the companionship he once knew. One morning, on a whim, Charles made a decision. He packed his bags, deciding to return to Africa. He didn't know what he was searching for, but he felt pulled, as if something, or someone, was waiting for him there. The city, the same one where Elizabeth wandered, was unknown to him. But he believed it held the answer to the question that had followed him for years. What was his life still meant to be? Elizabeth's day started as it always did. Her feet shuffled along the pavement, her eyes scanning the ground for anything to eat. She ignored the stares, the way people would move aside as if she were contagious. She had long since stopped caring what they thought. She reached into a bin, her fingers grasping a stale piece of bread, and as she turned, her gaze fell upon an old man sitting at a cafe. His face was calm, his eyes soft and thoughtful, as if he wasn't just looking at the busy street but seeing something more. There was something about him that made her pause. She stood there, bread in hand, watching him for a moment longer than she should have. He didn't turn away. Instead, his eyes met hers, and in that brief exchange, something shifted. Elizabeth felt it. A connection, small but undeniable. She shook it off and continued down the street, but the image of the old man stayed with her. Charles, too, found himself thinking of the young girl he had seen. Her eyes had held a strength he recognized, a fire that hadn't been extinguished despite the weight of her circumstances. The next day, he returned to the cafe, hoping to see her again. And there she was, moving slowly through the crowd, a figure out of place but with a quiet determination that intrigued him. He approached her slowly, careful not to startle her. "Are you hungry?" he asked gently, offering her a sandwich he had bought. Elizabeth stared at him, her eyes narrowing. Why would someone like him care? But hunger won out over suspicion, and she took the food, biting into it with quiet gratitude. They didn't talk much at first, just brief exchanges. Charles would sit at the cafe, and Elizabeth would linger nearby, sometimes accepting his offer of food, sometimes not. But over time, something began to change. Their glances turned into conversations, small at first, then longer, deeper. Elizabeth found herself telling him things she hadn't told anyone, about her childhood, her struggles, and the loneliness that gnawed at her. And Charles listened, truly listened, in a way no one else ever had. Days passed, and their bond grew. They spent more time together, walking through the market, sitting in quiet corners of the city, talking about everything and nothing. For the first time in years, Elizabeth felt seen, not as the girl living on the streets, but as a person with dreams, with a story worth telling. She began to trust him, this old man with a kind heart and a past filled with its own sorrows. Charles, too, felt something shift within him. He had come to Africa searching for purpose, and in Elizabeth, he had found it. Despite the gap in their ages and the differences in their lives, they understood each other in a way that transcended words. What had started as a simple friendship was slowly growing into something more, something deeper. The city noticed. People whispered as they walked by, speculating about the strange pair, the rich old man and the wild young girl. Some said Elizabeth was only after his money, while others claimed Charles had lost his mind. But neither of them cared. Their connection was too strong to be broken by gossip. And so, their relationship blossomed, their affection for each other growing with each passing day. Elizabeth, once the girl who lived in the shadows, now walked with her head held high. She had found someone who saw her, truly saw her. And Charles, who had been lost after his wife's death, had found new purpose in his twilight years. One evening, under a sky filled with stars, Charles reached into his pocket. His hands trembled slightly as he pulled out a small, simple ring. Elizabeth looked at him, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never imagined that someone like him, someone with so much wisdom, so much kindness, would ever want to spend his life with someone like her. With tears in his eyes, Charles asked her to marry him. For a moment, Elizabeth couldn't speak. The girl who had spent her life scavenging for scraps, who had been cast aside by society, was now being offered love, real, unconditional love. She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks, and whispered yes. In that moment, everything changed. The streets, the cold nights, the loneliness, they were behind her now. Elizabeth had found what she had always dreamed of: love, belonging, and a future filled with hope. Elizabeth moved through her days like she was floating, a lightness in her steps that hadn't been there before. She walked along familiar streets, but the weight that used to press on her shoulders was gone. No more digging through garbage, no more sleeping on hard pavement. Now, she sat with Charles at their favorite cafe, listening to his deep laughter as they talked about the future. Their futures. Eyes followed her wherever she went. People pointed and whispered, their looks sharp, but she didn't care. She wasn't just a girl on the streets anymore. Charles had given her a place where she was loved, where she was wanted. They spent days wandering the city together, looking for a home. It didn't have to be big, Elizabeth thought, but Charles insisted on finding something cozy. They visited small apartments, each one a little older than the last. Finally, they found it. The sunlight filled the tiny space, warming the cracked walls and the worn wooden floor. Elizabeth stood in the middle of the room, the sun brushing her face, and she knew this was it. It was hers. Charles stood at the doorway, watching her. There was something in his eyes, a quiet joy. He had found something too, after years of wandering alone, lost after his wife had passed. Now, as he looked at Elizabeth, he saw a new beginning. Their life together was simple, filled with quiet moments that stretched out like endless afternoons. Cooking side by side in the small kitchen, reading by the window as the city hummed outside, holding hands as they walked through the busy streets. It was enough. For Elizabeth, who had once had nothing, it was more than enough. One afternoon, as the wind stirred the leaves in the courtyard, Charles spoke up. His voice was soft, hesitant. "We should go to England. I'd love to show you where I grew up." Elizabeth felt a twist in her stomach. The thought of leaving scared her. But when she looked at Charles, saw the softness in his eyes, she nodded. "I'd like that," she said quietly. The trip wasn't grand. It was just them, heading to the country where Charles had spent his childhood. Elizabeth had never been on a plane before. The flight was smooth, but everything felt different when they arrived. The air was crisp, the streets quiet. Charles took her to the house where he had grown up, and she could see the memories in his eyes as they walked through the old park. But as they settled into the small cottage they had rented, Charles started to cough. At first, it seemed like nothing. But the cough wouldn't go away. Elizabeth worried, but Charles brushed it off with a smile. Still, she pushed him to see a doctor. When they finally went, the news hit like a wave. Charles was sick, and there wasn't much time left. The days became a blur. Elizabeth stayed close to him, never leaving his side. Each night, they would lie together, his hand resting in hers, his voice calm even as his body grew weaker. "I've had a good life," he whispered one night. "You've given me peace, Elizabeth." She cried silently, her heart breaking with every word. "I don't want to lose you." "You won't," he said, his voice barely above a breath. I'll always be with you. When the end came, they were back in Africa, in their little sunlit apartment. Charles passed away quietly, his hand still in hers, surrounded by the love they had built together. For a long time, the grief was unbearable. Elizabeth didn't know how to move forward. But slowly, as the days turned into weeks, she found strength in the memories they had shared. She stayed in the apartment, the life they had started together still alive in its walls. She became part of the community, reaching out to others who had been where she once was. She helped them, just as Charles had helped her. And though he was gone, she could still feel him beside her, his love guiding her as she stepped into a new life, a life filled with hope and meaning. And on quiet nights, when the city was still and the stars lit up the sky, Elizabeth would close her eyes. She could feel him, always there, like a warm breath in the cool air, beside her forever. If this story resonated with you and you're looking for more uplifting and inspiring tales, please like this video and subscribe to my channel. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Together, let's explore stories that highlight the incredible strength of the human spirit and the blessings life brings. Thank you for joining me on this journey. I'm excited to share more stories with you in the next video. Remember, embrace the positivity around you and believe in the incredible beauty of life. Let's keep inspiring one another.